So in order to make that happen, I have to go to record this session. So let me pop up and let them see the cover screen. CAEP Standard 3 today. We'll go on to goals and objectives. I've inserted that what we're really doing here is updating information on addressing Standard 3 and its components in your CAEP self-study. Throughout the self-study, throughout this presentation, I've highlighted in red anything that I've added that's new information. Okay, so that'll help you to sort through what, if you've attended an earlier Standard 3 webinar of mine, what's old, what's new, what's coming up. Good. What I hope you'll be able to do by the end of this webinar is really look closely at the language of Standard 3 and its components to see what kinds of things you need to address. I will be listing kinds of evidence that CAEP recommends that you include for each of the components, and that you'll be able to describe how these standards and how the standard and its components will be evaluated by CAEP reviewers. And then there's a whole new piece here about what will constitute the basis for assigning an area for improvement or assigning a stipulation, and we'll look into that more deeply as well. So that is definitely all new information. Okie doke. I start with the key points of the language of the standard itself, because when it comes to the end of your self-study for Standard 3, you'll be uploading buckets of evidence under the components, but you'll only be writing a narrative that responds to the language of this standard. So what you'll be addressing is how do you demonstrate that you have quality candidates, and that the quality of the candidates in your programs is something that's continual, from recruitment to admissions throughout the program of study and the progression of courses and clinical as well as field experiences, up to and including the decision that you make to recommend your completers for licensure or certification, and to say that your candidates are ready for hire, that they can teach effectively. So all of what you're demonstrating here is related to candidate quality. And as the standard says, ultimately, the quality of your candidates and, of course, their performance throughout your program is determined by the program's meeting Standard 4, which is all about the performance of your graduates once they're in service. So, in relation to quality and selectivity, there are 6 facets of that, and each one of those facets is one of the components underneath the standard itself. Recruitment, and you should be recruiting for academic ability as well as diversity. We'll delve into each one of these components in turn. At admissions, are you admitting candidates based on their academic ability and achievement, which is CAEP component 3.2, and in 3.3, are you setting and investigating non-academic factors? So are you also admitting candidates who meet additional criteria for admission that isn't simply based on GPA or test score results? Then, once you've admitted them, are you monitoring these candidates as they progress through your programs? Are you employing high exit criteria? And these are the decisions that completers are prepared to teach effectively and recommended for certification. You'll see a lot in this component when it comes to the evidence about candidate evidence of impact on P12 learning and development. And then finally, do they have a deep understanding of the professional and ethical aspects of teaching such that you can recommend them for certification? So, any questions, any comments, any feedback? I'm going to unmute everybody related to just the big picture of the standard itself. Okay, I should put on a little timer for wait time. It actually has been shown in the research that waiting longer, doing longer wait time for adults is not productive. It is for children, but with adults it doesn't always result in someone speaking up. So I'm going to move on forward with the next part of the standard. We're going to talk about each of the components in turn. And first of all, we're going to talk about component 3.1. It's all about recruitment. And what the basic point here is, are you planning to, and do you have goals for recruiting and supporting the completion of candidates that are diverse? They're coming from a broad range of backgrounds and diverse populations. The standard, the wording of the component suggests that your admitted pool is going to reflect the diversity of America's P-12 students. So you're wanting to demonstrate that you know and are addressing needs in shortage areas as well as hard-to-staff schools. However, as we go in to talk about the, or not so much however, but in addition to that, as we go in and look at what some of the evidence is and what are some of the criteria for sufficiency to meet the standard, you'll see where CAEP is putting more emphasis on the diversity of your recruitment, that there is a result that is demonstrating that you're attempting to recruit more diverse candidates. So what you want to think about here, whoops, and I've muted everybody, but I'm going to mute you again. There we go. I heard some lovely music. So think, what recruitment evidence, what plans and goals do you have or can you construct that will demonstrate that you're attempting to attract diverse candidates who are going to meet identified needs in your region, in your state, or national needs? Okay. So these are possible sources of evidence that CAEP is suggesting. Included in red are some additional fine details that are new from the last time. You definitely want a recruitment plan that's showing that you're reaching out to diverse and academically able candidates. And CAEP has been specific in saying that that should include ELL students. It should include students or candidates with disabilities. You're looking to diversify the teaching force here. You're also wanting to provide in your recruitment plan evidence that your goals are based on completers' existing and forecasted employment needs and opportunities. So not only are you recruiting for a particular candidate, but you're also recruiting into programs that will meet your local, state, or national needs. And in there, CAEP has been specific about saying STEM fields, recruitment into STEM fields, recruitment into English language learning, perhaps TESOL, perhaps bilingual education programs to prepare teachers. Also, recruitment into hard-to-staff schools. There was a transformation initiative done a few years ago in Springfield, Missouri that was a collaboration of 3 local EPPs who focused their attention on Title I schools. And so those were traditionally, in their area, hard-to-staff schools, and their recruitment efforts and their preparation program focused on meeting the needs of children in those schools. So they're also looking for what evidence might you put forward that you've collaborated with other providers, perhaps in terms of your recruitment plans. Or in developing programs. Exactly reporting on, there are 2 things you're going to want to report on. And one are your numerical goals and baseline data on your admitted cohorts. What is your application, your acceptance, and your enrollment rates? Okay, and another thing to report on is disaggregating data of admitted candidates. Or you could do applied candidates, accepted candidates, and enrolled candidates, disaggregating that data by SES, social economic status, by gender, by ethnicity, etc., any other dimensions that would be useful to you as an EPP to determine perhaps what other areas you might recruit to. For example, males in elementary or early childhood education is traditionally an area of need. So what are your reviewers going to be looking for in component 3.1? Remember, this isn't something where you've told your story per se. This is someplace in component 3.1 where you've uploaded hard evidence of meeting or of addressing component 3.1 of recruitment. So what recruiters are going to look for is a recruitment plan, okay, over the next 5 years. Okay, it says 5 to 7 years out, certainly. But as you'll see in a moment, sufficiency criteria look for about 5 years out in a recruitment plan, and that you've got baseline data that you're saying, okay, here's where we are today with these kinds of candidates in these kinds of programs. Here's what we're going to be recruiting for, and here are our goals to increase, the number of admitted candidates from a culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds by 25%, whatever that plan contains. This is what I was referring to earlier when I said your recruitment plan and its implementation, have moved you towards the goal of greater candidate diversity, however you're defining that and expressing that in your local area. So, reviewers are also going to look for data on admitted and enrolled candidates that are disaggregated, and we spoke about that a moment ago. They should be providing some kind of evidence that the results, are being recorded, are being monitored, and are being used. So if you've got a recruitment plan and you're out there, what are the results of that plan? How are you monitoring that? And how are you using those results to improve your recruitment? So the and used part of this is new language in some of the CAEP documents that I referenced to create these PowerPoints. They're looking for you being able to explicitly address recruiting to STEM, to special education, to ELL, and hard-to-staff schools. And I've added the language of special education and hard-to-staff schools because, again, that appears explicitly in some new materials, the accreditation handbook specifically. And this is an entirely new one, is that there's evidence that that as a provider, you're monitoring the influence of employment opportunities and employment patterns. So as your state perhaps comes out and says, look, we look to have a shortage of math teachers in the middle grades over the next 5 years, it would be heaven if that kind of information were available. But if it is in your state, that you're monitoring those kinds of needs and that you're using that to inform your recruitments. And such that you're using the results in planning and preparing for shifty cohorts, not shifty cohorts, shifting cohorts that include modification of your recruitment strategy. So basically it's a give and take amongst your recruitment efforts and your plans and your outcomes, and using that information to better inform your recruitment. Okay, I've got a couple more slides here. This is what CAEP is putting out. CAEP now has in the new accreditation manual a rubric that appears around in the 40s, page 40s on Standard 3, that really talks about, okay, what's the baseline sufficiency level at which if people have this, they will be judged by your reviewers, to have addressed the component adequately. And the criteria is that you've got a recruitment plan, you can base it on your mission. And as I said, it comes out that they're looking for 5 years of a recruitment plan, but certainly you can go longer than that. And that you're including academic ability, you're including diversity, and you're including employment needs in those plans and goals. That you've got disaggregated data, that you're using the results of your recruitment plans and efforts, that you're addressing employment opportunities, basically many of the things that we just looked at in terms of what are some possible sources of evidence. These map on to those sources of evidence pretty much one-to-one. Okay? So what else have we got? Well, let's take a look at what an area for improvement or a stipulation might be assigned. And these I'm excerpting, or I'm extrapolating, actually, from the insufficient column on those rubrics that appear in the new version of the accreditation manual. If there is limited or no evidence of any kind of a recruitment plan, you're probably going to get an area for improvement assigned or stipulation. If your data aren't disaggregated, your employment, your admissions to, application, recruitment to application to admission to enrollment isn't disaggregated by race, ethnicity, SES, and or gender. It does say sex in the accreditation manual. If there's limited or no evidence that an EPP has identified the employment opportunities or needs in its area. So if you don't have kind of a sense of what the school's needs are going to be in the future. That could be an area for improvement. And if you're not addressing those STEM and ELL opportunities, as well as hard-to-staff schools and special education, if you're not addressing that in your analysis of shortage areas, you could get an area for improvement or stipulation. Now, I want to pause for a second because I'm assuming that everybody knows what an AFI and a stipulation are. So let me simply state that an area for improvement is, if you'll allow the terminology, a weakness that could be improved in your preparation program. A stipulation is a really strong weakness. It's an area that is of concern to the reviewers about your meeting the CAEP standard and could well result in not meeting the standard if it accumulates, and you'll see that at the end of this PowerPoint. And a stipulation is of sufficient severity that CAEP may request evidence that you've remediated this, that you've come into compliance is another way to say it, that you've fixed what's wrong within 2 years. Okay, so areas for improvement need to be addressed within 7 years, sometime as you're moving towards your next accreditation visit. A stipulation will need to be addressed much sooner. Okay, any feedback, any questions at this point? And I'm going to unmute everybody, so if anybody wants to speak up, please do. Or let me check also. I'm going to check my, lost my mouse there. There we go. I'm going to check the chat room. Let's see what's coming.
Say hi.
Great. I got a good question here that says,
what?
Can I please provide examples of non-academic factors?
What? Just may ask the question. Yes,
non-academic factors are like your disposition.
Rationale. Can you hear me?
You screen candidates at admission with an essay or with viewing a video, and they are supposed to comment on what they're observing in a teacher, and you're looking to see if they realize that there's been some negative behavior displayed, and if they don't call it out, you might, these are some of the non-academic factors. Okay, so aside from, maybe you consider recommendations really strongly. Maybe you have an essay that you consider really, really important about their passion or commitment to education and becoming a teacher. Anyways, those are some of the things I've heard of, including that piece about watching a video and having candidates do some kind of a rolling commentary about strengths that they might have seen in the way that a teacher has handled a particular situation. So that's an example of non-academic factors. And we'll get into that a lot more when we go into component 3.3. So stay tuned.
Good.
Should that be further broken down by program? And I think that question has to do with any data. Any data that you present to CAEP, I would really recommend that you break it down by licensure area. And in fact, we're going to get to that at the very tail end, where there are some general rules, okay, for Standard 3. And I can actually jump ahead to that if you think it'd be a good idea. But one of the general rules is that data that you're presenting on candidates is also disaggregated by licensure area. I'm not saying by program, because a very smart person from one of the EPPs in my webinar session said, but wait a minute, we have a program called secondary education. Can we just disaggregate by secondary programs? And the answer from CAEP is no. You can't. They really want to see licensure areas. So if you have a secondary program, secondary education program, and you've got within that English and history and chemistry and physics and mathematics, they want to see all those distinct licensure areas when data is reported. Okay, let me scroll down, see. Okay, what is the rationale for stating the need for diversity when traditionally minorities, ELL, and students with disabilities do not do well on standardized admissions tests? Well, here's what. As you know, the CAEP standard for standardized exams and GPAs comes up in a minute. That's under component 3.2. And some of the language of that component talks about the cohort average. And so what it's saying here is that you can admit candidates who do not perform at a certain level on a standardized test or a GPA, provided that some of your other candidates are strong so that your average comes out to be at the CAEP minima. I'm going to mention it in a moment under 3.2. CAEP did commission a study of component 3.2 and those criteria, and the report on that study has come out and is available on the CAEP website. I'll show you where to find it. And it talks specifically about the impact of raising admissions criteria, both on GPA and on standardized test scores, and the impact of those criteria on admissions. And so some very, very interesting reading. I recommend it highly, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay, will the slides be available for referencing? Yes, they sure will. I said earlier, if you shoot me a quick email at the end of this presentation, I'll put my email address on the final slide, but it's also going to be uploaded along with the recording of this session, so you'll be able to hear the recording and connect to the PowerPoint slides. Another question says, the increased GPA may affect diverse populations completing our programs as well. And yes, again, I'd really recommend that you take a peek at this study that came out. It's still continuing. They're doing some focus groups with additional people, but there's some interesting information about how CAEP might consider implementing this standard because of some of it due to impact on enrollments and diverse candidates. As that standard currently reads, it'll increase over time, and the study's very explicit about addressing that. Oh, I hear you can't hear me anymore. My audio, computer audio, shows that I'm loud and clear. So I hope, and someone else is telling me they can hear me just fine. So whoever can't hear me, the problem may be at your end. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for tuning in to me. I'm going to take one more question here, and then we're going to move on. It's already 5:24, and we've only gone through one component. There are 5 more, plus the end of the thing, so I'm going to fast forward. So this question says, are you saying to recruit to the special education program rather than recruiting special education students to the program? Here's what I'm saying. I think I'm saying both. Is that having good teachers for special education students themselves is often an area of need, and we hear that across a number of states that they need special education teachers, and so recruiting into a special education program. For example, many EPPs are developing dual licensure programs for elementary education, special education, because there aren't many positions open for general education, elementary education students, but if you come in with a dual degree, so that you've got special education licensure in addition to elementary education, then your chances of being hired are really much greater, because there's a lot more inclusion now, and inclusion classrooms where there are often teen teachers, etc. So you get the picture. So recruiting into a program like that would be a good idea. It's also true that we should be recruiting candidates with disabilities into our programs. Okay, so I think it works both ways, and thank you for the question. All right, folks, going to scroll down here, and everybody says they can hear me. So I'm going to move on. Let's go into 3.2, and I'm going to drag my screen out of the way here. Okay, this is the one on admissions criteria. This is the one you must meet. In the CAEP components under Standard 3, you must address all 6 components, but you only have to meet component 3.2. in order to pass the standard, you must meet this one about admissions. So let's take a peek at what this actually means. Three things to know about this. One is that you set admissions criteria. Okay, whether it's CAEP minima, the state's minima, graduate school minima, whichever is highest, and you gather data. Okay, so you're monitoring those applicants and your selected pool. They're looking for a cohort average of 3.0 in terms of GPA. So what that means is that you can have some candidates who are 2.7, even 2.5. But if you've got other candidates who are at 3.3 or 3.5, then it's all going to be okay. And people have said, well, what do you mean by a cohort? Well, what CAEP says about that is it's a group of candidates. They're admitted at the same time. Now, perhaps you have rolling admissions where you're admitting candidates. Many online programs have this where there's rolling admissions and candidates are admitted throughout the year, every month, whenever. Then you get to establish a particular set point on your own and say, okay, we consider, the cluster of admitted pool to be every January and every June, and you sort of aggregate the candidates' admissions across that time. All right? So you get to determine what the specific parameters of the cohort would be. Traditionally, in your higher education institutions, admissions are fall only, or fall and spring, and those would be admitted cohorts. And if you were to include 3 cycles of data on admissions, then you would include fall, spring, fall. Okay. So then it also talks about a group average performance on national normed ability tests or assessments. They talk about the ACT, the SAT, the GRE. The current standard is that your candidates, your recruitment plan, and perhaps your candidates are going to say that you're recruiting from the top 50% in these exams. I know that there are some national benchmarks that are out there, certainly for ACT, SAT, GRE, so that you can see what the national average is. And CAEP is looking for 50%, okay, in 16-17. And currently, until this study is complete, that I was referencing earlier, this is the point at which the standard is frozen. Okay? So you must meet at least 50% or higher as a group average in 2016-2017. All right, let's move forward on this to the next piece of information. So component 3.2 goes on to talk about a couple of variations in how to address this standard and that are acceptable to CAEP. And one is that California, among other states, has specified a particular admissions ability achievement test of their own devising. And so what CAEP is saying is if this is true in your state, then what they're looking for is a correspondence between those state admission tests and nationally normed tests. And CAEP's going to work with the states through this. It's also saying that over time, if you can develop a valid and reliable measure that uses criteria other than those that are stated in these standards, by all means do so. And I have a tendency to call this paragraph the Mary Dietz exception. And because Mary was the dean at Alverno, which had admitted anyone who wanted to come into teacher preparation to come into teacher preparation, and she felt very strongly about that. However, Mary's contention was that everybody who wants to come into teacher preparation should be able to do so, but not everyone will be able to complete the program and meet our standards to be recommended for licensure. And she had data to back that up, that admitting students, working with candidates in order to bring them up to the level of performance that they required, or to cancel them out of the program if they were found to be not performing at the level expected, that this too could be acceptable. And so if you don't use CAEP criteria for admissions, you use other criteria. What they're suggesting here is establish a semi-study of yourself, of what your admissions criteria are and what are the results of that over time. Okay, and it does say that they're looking for multiple evaluations and sources of evidence. So let me go on to the next slide and show you frequently asked questions as well as the study you can refer to. And I'll pause. I do see questions coming up in the chat, and I'll pause for those when I get done with this component. So there's a whole set of frequently asked questions about CAEP resources, and I'm even going to show you what I'm talking about here. Here's the frequently asked questions for Standard 3. And it's got a lot of questions about, components, the 6 recruitment, what's the purpose, what does CAEP expect as evidence of diversity, is there a mechanism to address unintended consequences? All of this is available on the CAEP website, and it is. Go to accreditation, then scroll down to CAEP accreditation resources, and then scroll down to the bottom of the page, and you click on Standard 3 FAQs, and that's where you'll find those materials. And it's really a good read. There are some questions that are pretty typical that CAEP has taken the time to provide some in-depth responses to. So if you haven't seen that document, definitely go find it. And the other one is the Teacher Preparation Analytics Study. When you go in and click on this to Standard 3 FAQs, you will find a statement from Emerson Elliott about the Teacher Preparation Analytics Study. I just read it. It's extensive. It's over 100 pages. It has a tremendous amount of information. I think they did a great job of looking at this issue of having admission standards related to GPA and tests. Particularly the test is what they were looking at. The 50% going up to 60% and up to 75%, I think, or 67%. In any case, those incremental increases in how we're admitting candidates into our programs is what this study looked into in depth, and to look at what would be the implications of having that standard set that bar in that way. And it's fascinating. Like I said, there's over 100 pages. I'm not going to review those with you now. I highly recommend you go in and check on it yourself. In and around page 7, there's a couple of pages of important findings. So if you want the Reader's Digest or Cliff Notes version, just go right to that section and you'll get a snapshot of what some of the findings are. Possible sources of evidence for component 3.2, of course, the data on your admission criteria and your cohort average. Okay, they expect that to be explicit. Again, if you're going to present a data set here, someone asked the question, yes, you want to disaggregate it. You can put in your EPP average. All our candidates for all our programs, the cohort average is blah, and then disaggregate by licensure area. Provide data from a reliable model with P12 student learning outcomes. This is if you're not going to address the CAEP standards and you're going to propose a model of your own device, then it better be in there. Okay? If you're showing data-based evidence, you want to include the N for any data you break out. Low enrollment programs, which means under 10 graduates over 3 years, 10 graduates or fewer over 3 years, then you can aggregate across those 3 years. You need 3 cycles of data and provide comparison points. So if it's a national average on the SAT and here's where your candidates sit, perfect. And if you're reporting the mean score, and this is in red because I just read this as a new piece, the range standard deviation should be reported as well. And you should include the percentage of students who are below 3.0. So if your cohort average is 3.0, the range could be from 2.4 to 3.9. Okay, and then you would say of the N is 100 candidates, there's 15% of the candidates are below the 3.0 minimum. Okay, that's the kind of reporting that they're going to want for component 3.2. So this is basically, what are the reviewers looking for? They're going to look that you're reporting the average scores on GPA and performance on those tests, or that you've got a similar performance if you're using a state test, or that you've got your own model that you're presenting that also show that there are positive correlations with P12 student learning. And I'm not sure how many of us at this point could be far enough along in a study of our admissions criteria to be able to link that to the standard 4 data on completer, in-service, teacher performance, and student achievement. So that would be something that you'd have to plan for long term if you were to present a reliable model. So what are the criteria for sufficiency? Well, first there's this all general rules for standard 3 are met. And the general rules are, and they appear on a later slide, that you've got 3 cycles of data, that data is disaggregated by licensure area, etc. And you can see that as the next point. You've got to have that disaggregated data by licensure area. The average score meets the CAEP minima, and again, or your state test meets the minima, or you've got a model that shows that you have a positive impact on P12 learning and that your academic achievement correlates. Okay. An AFI, or a stipulation, may be assigned if you're not documenting the cohort average and if you've got superficial information but no reliable, valid model that uses different criteria. Okay, so basically, be it 50%, be it 3.0 for average cohort performance, or present a model that is detailed enough that CAEP would consider it sufficient to judge that you are selecting high-quality candidates into your programs. So the next slide is my question slide, and I'm going to go into the chat because I do see some questions appearing there. Let me go up a little. Okay, good. One question is all I have at this time, and then I'll unmute everybody in case someone wants to speak up. The national score reports I have found are dated only through the year 2011. Will you be guiding us to sites where we can find the data you'd like us to compare to? The answer to that is no. And I don't believe that CAEP has provided that information. And so what I would suggest is that when you do upload comparative data sets, let's say you do a national average, you'll have a little asterisk or sign that says, from 2011, latest available. Okay? If the reviewers have any questions about that, they will include it in your off-site report. But I will say I think it's unlikely that anything like that would lead to an area for improvement or a stipulation. Use the best available, okay, and that should be sufficient for CAEP purposes. Okay, let me see if I find any other questions here. No? Nope, I don't. Okay, let me unmute everyone and see. Any questions there? Anybody want to speak up?
Debbie, hi. This is Damon College.
Hi.
Pearson has data that they don't have for us just yet. Like for the MAT?
Yes.
And are they going to be getting that data for us, national data for us?
Interesting. I just got an email from somebody about national data. Pearson on their NES, National Evaluation System data, says that they won't have national data available, but they will have state averages that you can access.
Okay, so I can compare our data to state averages.
Yes, because they say that they're not going to have it available. You know what? If you will email me again after this, I'll send you the response. I just posted it on one of the professional learning communities so that people had that information. So if you would like to email me, and I'll send you what they sent along with the person who sent it. And you can
Okay.
include it in your notes, okay, to CAEP that says, here, since Pearson says they won't have it, see email below.
Okay.
This is
Debbie,
what
I
we
have
did.
one more question for you.
Yes, go ahead.
With all of this data of other schools, there are so many sites. So if I'm going to a site and I find this data and I'm comparing it to this site, and so another school finds this and they compare it to this, I mean, I'm not sure that's good data
Mm-hmm.
across the board, good data. So wouldn't it be a better idea if we had localized, like a sites where we could go and compare our schools to?
Yes, ideally that would be the case. Ideally, that would be the case. And I know at one time back when I was at CAEP, and it wasn't that long ago, the intention was that they would be creating a data dashboard that would have some of this information and would have aggregated data where you could pull down on a menu, for example, institutions that were most like you, okay?
Yeah.
Rural, you know, of a certain size and a certain Carnegie classification, you know, whatever. And you
Yeah.
could see the data aggregated for other sites so that you could compare yourselves that way. I know that that was a very strong intention, but I don't think they've gotten too far with that as yet.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Anybody else? If not, we're going to plow ahead. We've got barely 15 minutes left and so much to go over, so I may not belabor some of this too much. These are those additional selectivity factors. Somebody asked, what are the non-academic factors? Okay, as you see, attributes and dispositions that go beyond academic ability. Okay, you select these criteria, describe the measures you use, provide evidence of reliability and validity, and report data about how academic and non-academic factors predict candidate performance. So what you're thinking about is, what data do I have that I could demonstrate other things besides GPA and test scores that you look for at admissions that do result in selecting high-quality candidates for your programs? Okay, here are some references from CAEP. When I send you the email, you will get some of these. These are mostly dispositional related things. It talks about grit, perseverance, as well as passion. It's got Haberman's work on urban poverty, what makes for good teachers of children in poverty. There's a number of references from Teach for America here because they've demonstrated that having certain characteristics of leadership lead to greater success in the classroom and in influencing student achievement. And then, of course, Danielson's framework for learning to teach, which also has some additional dimensions to it. I've had people ask about using the INTAS dispositions associated with the INTAS standards, and I say certainly all of those, I think, are logical places to derive additional factors beyond GPA. And plausible sources of evidence. You'll see a lot of red on this slide because CAEP, I think, has gotten a little bit clearer about what are some sources of evidence you could present. As you can see, those non-academic factors include grit, empathy, cultural awareness, commitment. And basically, CAEP is saying they hope that you're establishing some attributes and dispositions at admission and that these factors are grounded in the research literature. Okay, you've got a strong basis for having chosen this particular attribute or disposition, non-academic factor by which to be selective in terms of admitting candidates. So they want to see that if you have these and you're assessing these non-academic admission criteria, that at least you have some content validity associated with that there are protocols and criteria established for your interviews and other alternate forms of evaluation, whether those are recommendations, video viewings, responding to a scenario in writing, essays, whatever. There are protocols and criteria established for evaluating those. And that you can provide a description of how these non-academic factors are applied at admission and how they're monitored during your preparation. And that you've got evidence that supports the use of the identified criteria. So not only you have these criteria and here's how you screen for these criteria and here's how you use them throughout their programs, but also here's how you are using these identified criteria and using and improving. Okay, criteria for sufficiency. The title's in red because all of this is in red, I said, along with those new rubrics. That you're documenting evidence of using non-academic criteria, you've got a rationale for them, you're monitoring it, and you're associating or correlating these non-academic criteria with candidate and completer performance. Personally, I think that could be a really fun thing to look at. You know, whether or not GPA or, you know, the candidate's essay or recommendation better predict their performance in a graduate program or a teacher preparation program, which are not all graduates. So there you go. That's the criteria for sufficiency. So what's going to happen, or what are the criteria by which you're going to be found to be insufficient and could end up with an area for improvement or stipulation, is that you don't have any additional selectivity factors at admission or during preparation. So you go with a pure GPA and a test score, you're okay, but might get an AFI or stipulation there. If you've got absolutely no evidence that you're monitoring the progress of individual candidates, or if you've got limited or no association with these non-academic criteria in terms of candidate or completer performance. So they are looking for some kind of tracking and monitoring over time. And if not, probably get some questions thrown at you. So let me drag my screen over here, see if we have any other questions that are shown. Yes, of course. Someone says, you know, dispositions are very difficult to observe and measure. Absolutely right. Of course they are. And so one of the things, you know, that's why CAEP's built in not very explicit directions about how to do that work, but rather you should do it. I do understand that Susan, hyphenated last name, Feynman Nemser, did a long study of dispositions at one time, and there was a book that came out about that I think is quite fascinating. As a reference point, might be interesting to look back at her work to see what they found out about dispositions. So, anything else? Nope, no other questions there. I'm unmuting you all for a minute. Anybody? Okay, talk amongst yourselves. Forging ahead here. 3-4. This is the standard, the component of the standard that goes into your selectivity during preparation. And so I think if you've been NCATE accredited in the past, you knew you had to have transition points. And I think that the CAEP point here is it's the transition points on steroids. Everybody sort of had to show that they had them, but there wasn't too much emphasis put on, okay, what's your data about the candidates at each transition point, and how have you used that as a selectivity measure. Okay, so what you're trying to present is anything that can demonstrate that you continue to be selective with candidates throughout your programs. Okay, what is some of the, well, that doesn't want to advance. Okay, 2 or more measures from key decision points. So one of CAEP's things has been that, you know, pretty much everybody checks candidates at admissions and then at exit, but you need to have a couple of decision points in between. And I think, quite frankly, many of us do. We get admissions, we get, you know, prior to student teaching or at the end of, you know, academic coursework, at the end of student teaching or during student teaching, and then at exit. So all of those. What is new here is that there are decision points on candidate retention, that there are decision points regarding the assessments that are used, what kind of interventions you take, what are the results of those interventions, and what are your explanations for actions taken. Okay, so they're not only looking for a record of the measures that you employ at key decision points, but also what you're doing with those measures. And then it measures on whether the proficiencies that the candidates are demonstrating are actually developing over time. So you're looking for their ability to teach to college and career-ready standards over time. So this is directly related to CAEP Standard 1, well, Component 1.4 and in Standard 1. Their content knowledge, CAEP 1.1. Pedagogical content knowledge, CAEP 1.1. Pedagogical skills, CAEP 1.1 and 2.3. And the integration of technology with instruction, CAEP 1.5. So here with this particular component, you may not be uploading any new evidence that you haven't already had as a part of the components in Standard 1. And so please, make use of cross-tagging when you're uploading evidence. Criteria for sufficiency, again, that you've got at least 2 or more measures or gateways for candidate progress, and that you have explicit criteria for monitoring those with a focus on candidate development so that candidates know what they're expected to demonstrate through time and what the consequences or the implications of that monitoring may be. So evidence of decision, the proficiencies is the same as we just shared. A lot of this straight out of Standard 1, which are you're monitoring the college and career-ready standards, teaching content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, technology. In addition, the results or candidate progressions align with evidence of actions taken, such as. So, as you're monitoring the candidate's development over time, you're also making changes in your curriculum or changes in the expectations for your clinical experiences. You're providing interventions and saying, look, you really need to work harder on this or that. Or that you're counseling candidates out of your programs who are demonstrating that teaching is not the best fit for them. Okie dokie. We'll go on to the next slide. We're almost done here. What might constitute an area for improvement or stipulation? If you use beginning and exit measures, but there's no evidence of monitoring progress during the preparation program, and if the measures themselves provide no evidence of developing proficiencies during preparation. So, for example, in Standard 1, it often asks for what the candidates can do upon completion of the program. And so if you're just showing what candidates can do at completion, it doesn't demonstrate how their progress throughout the programs. And so this will be an opportunity for you to perhaps fine-tune the data sets that show that candidates are being monitored throughout your programs and that there is a progression in their skill development across those programs. Now I do see another question coming up on the chat. You don't understand how happy it makes me to get questions, okay? I often feel like I'm talking to myself in these webinars, and I'm delighted that questions are coming up. So, are there any criteria for conditional admittance for students that don't have a 3.0? Well, part of it is that it's a cohort average, so you can have students that don't have a 3.0. That's part of the standard and its expectation. But let's say you have candidates who don't achieve in terms of their entering dispositions or attributes that you don't really see a strong commitment to teaching. So you say, tell you what, we're going to let you come in and, show a development of that commitment over time, at least in the first 6 months of the program and maybe in your first field experience. These are the kinds of things that you can do. That's your prerogative. There aren't any CAEP criteria there. And what I would suggest you do is when you do have conditionally admitted students that you tag them as such so that you can monitor their progress and present that as part of your data set, that these are conditionally admitted students and these are the criteria that we found to be particularly important. These are the criteria that we found that if candidates didn't develop, that we canceled them out. So you want to do that sort of progress monitoring as well. me see if there are any other questions. Yes, another one. How does the progressions in CAEP compare to the progressions used in InTask? They compare one-on-one. When CAEP talks about at the appropriate progression levels, they're really talking about the InTask progression of a beginning teacher. And that's what they're hoping that candidates are working towards and will achieve at the point where you recommend them for licensure. So when CAEP talks about progressions, they're talking about InTask progressions. And thank you for asking that question. That had always puzzled me. And so I went directly to CAEP and said, what do you mean by this? Because I wasn't sure. So there you go. Final answer, as they say on the talk shows. Okay, I'm going to drag it back over to the side now, and we're going to continue with the next component. We're at 5:57, have 3 minutes to go. This is the selection at completion component. What you're going to want to do is provide data that you can demonstrate that your exit criteria are rigorous. Okay, they have a high standard for content knowledge, can teach effectively, and have positive impacts on P12 student learning. I think I mentioned earlier that this would be the component that would talk the most about impact on P12 students' learning. You know that Standard 4 is all about impact, but it's all about impact of in-service candidates, in-service program completers. This particular component, 3.5, is about the impact of your pre-service candidates, okay? And whether you're assessing their impact on learning in methods courses or clinical experience or at exit with a culminating or capstone assessment, however you're doing that, it's critically important in component 3.5 that you'll be showing your evidence that by completion your candidates have demonstrated that they have a positive impact on P12 learning and development. And as you can see here as well, evidence that is used for part of the documentation for Standard 1 is to be expected here in Standard 3. And I mentioned that you can cross-tag and cross-reference some of your evidence here. So you can use your evidence from 1.1 on candidate competence and present that here under component 3.5 to show that at exit your candidates have strong content knowledge, pedagogical skills, etc., etc. And you can also upload information on the alignment of specialty area standards. So what you presented in 1.3 that shows how your various programs are aligned with specialty program standards could also be shown here and used as evidence that by completion they have the skill set and are necessary in order to be good, effective beginning teachers. Okay? Okay. Let's go to the next slide here so that you can see what's the criteria for sufficiency. First bullet, evidence that's going to be the same as you might have for component 1.1, but also evidence that documents effective teaching. And this strongly includes positive impacts on P12 student learning and development for all candidates. So again, what many people have asked me is about this impact on student learning and that it's all in Standard 4. And I say to you, no, impact on student learning for candidates is also in component 1.1. It's also in component 2.3 in clinical experience, and it's a big part of this component 3.5 on exit standards and ongoing selectivity of candidates. Okay, I think I'm going to blaze past this at 6 o'clock and move on and stop for questions. I don't see another one having come up on the chat, so let's just get through this final component that deals with professional ethics and the expectations of the profession. So what you're wanting to do here is what can you present, what data or evidence can you present to show that your candidates understand, and I put the professional do's and don'ts of teaching. You know, sometimes I'm horrified with what I hear certified teachers doing, and I always want to know, where was that person prepared? So Expectations of the profession. What does that mean? What does CAEP mean by that? They mean, topical knowledge of the codes of ethics, professional standards in your state, relevant laws and policies. So this could be a part of course materials, part of your assessments. It could be the results of any instruments that assess candidates' understanding of special education laws. So for example, if there's a section, I know New York State has a requirement that students know, candidates, no matter what they're being, what licensure area they're being prepared for, have an understanding of special education disabilities in this particular section 504. And there is a piece in one of their assessments that directly addresses this. So providing those subtest scores in this component would be a good thing. Okay, and if you have evidence of specialized training, again, I know New York State pretty well. I know that they have, you must attend a workshop on anti-bullying. You must attend a workshop on harassment and sexual harassment. You must attend a workshop on in-school violence and preventing and intervening. And so these are examples of specialized training required of candidates prior to certification. So this also could be something to provide evidence of to meet component 3.6 on professional ethics and responsibilities. So CAEP's going to deem you having met this with sufficiency if you can demonstrate that your candidates understand professional standards of practice and that they know relevant laws and policies. Where you might get a stipulation here is if there's no documentation of their understanding this, or if you can provide little or no documentation that they know what the relevant laws and policies are in their state for certification. So, yeah, that's about it for this particular one. Remember, with these components, you need to simply address all of the components. You need to meet, and the bar has been raised, you need to meet component 3.2, but you must address the other components. So let's double back for just a minute here in revisiting the language of the standard, because after you've uploaded evidence for all of these components, you're going to write a narrative that shows how your evidence demonstrates that you meet the standards. And the standard is that you are selecting quality candidates from recruitment to admissions throughout their programs and eventually recommend the strongest possible program completers for licensure to become beginning teachers. So general rules for Standard 3 are these. You've got to have 3 cycles of data. I think you understand that cycles may mean semesters. It may mean years. If you're using state licensure exams, 3 cycles will mean 3 years. That those cycles need to be sequential. Can't skip a year or skip a semester if the results aren't so good. You got to put them forward no matter what, and they've got to be the latest available. So you can't go back if your report's due in 2017, you can't go back to 2012 and present data from 12, 13, and 14. It really needs to be the most recent you have available and sequential. And again, I've said this enough. You address every component, but you must meet that component 3.2 that deals with GPA and test scores at admissions. When are you going to get a stipulation or an AFI? I'm extrapolating these from information that's come out relevant to standards 1 and 2 because it applies here as well. And that is, if you're using EPAP created instruments and they're being judged with significant deficiencies, you're likely to get an AFI for standard 3. If there are inaccuracies in reporting data from original sources. And it's particularly important here because one new thing that reviewers will be doing is checking on your data. Okay, so let's say you say, well, we have a mean of blah, blah at candidate admission, and for our non-academic criteria, your reviewers may well ask to see the data set that you derive those means from and do their own calculations. If you don't analyze your evidence, okay, and what it says, not significantly digging deeply into your own data, then you're going to end up with an AFI, and if your interpretations are not well grounded in the evidence. And this is sort of a typical sort of overstating what it is that the data show. So just remember your old doctoral dissertation days, and when your dissertation advisor told you, you can't say that based on your results. So keep that in mind. A stipulation, as I said, is a more serious weakness, and it can be assigned if there's no evidence of internal consideration of the evidence for improvement purposes. So if you're not showing how you're using your recruitment plan and your admissions criteria, etc., and making changes in things, then that could be the basis for a stipulation. And if you have made absolutely no efforts to ensure the validity of your evidence, then that too could result in a stipulation. And I do see questions coming up. You're going to be, this too I'm extrapolating from other things. Standard 3 might be found unmet if component 3.2 is found to be unmet. If there are 2 or more stipulations, and I've described a number of ways that stipulations could be assigned in any of the components under Standard 3, but if you sort of accumulate 2 or more, there could be an unmet standard as a result. And see, it's not 2 or more areas for improvement, it's 2 or more stipulations, meaning these are significant things you've got to fix within 2 years. So if you've got 2 or more of those within the components of Standard 3, it could be an unmet standard. If any EPP instruments you use are preponderantly rated low in quality, and if you do not disaggregate by licensure area. So it gets back to that point that we have visited earlier. There's my final feedback and question pause. I'm going to leave this up for you to look at while I answer some questions that I see in the chat room. This shows you the next couple of webinars that are coming in and how to access those. Did I mention where we can access this PowerPoint presentation? Yes, I did. You can email me at deb.eldridge, my last name, ELDRIDGE, at gmail.com, and I will send it out to you immediately following this webinar. However, when the recording is converted and uploaded to YouTube, it will also contain an attachment, which is the PowerPoint presentation. So email me or get it off the YouTube when it comes. I'm so embarrassed that this stuff is going up on YouTube now. Okay, one more question about GPA. Does it matter how GPA is calculated? Can it be calculated on just the courses needed in elementary ed major, or does it need to be calculated on all courses? Well, that's a really good question, because you're calculating GPA at the point of admissions. And so, since you determine when that admission point is, you get to determine what is included in that GPA. Of course, CAEP will want an explanation of that, because if you calculate your GPA based on, let's say, some places have the sort of pre-teacher preparation program courses as well as academic course GPA, and they combine those to compute an overall GPA at admissions. Some people just use completion of, freshman and sophomore years and GPA, cumulative GPA at that point. So however you calculate it, be sure to report to CAEP how that has been done. And again, if the reviewers have any questions, they'll definitely raise that issue, since component 3.2 must be met. And this question is directly related to component 3.2. If the reviewers have a question, they're going to ask it, and you'll get that in your off-site report. Okay, so, and so the rest of the question asks, could it be calculated on all courses attempted in a college career? Of course, let's say this is a post-bac program an MAT program or a master's program, yes, you can use undergraduate GPA if you wanted to. Okay, so it doesn't really change my response, which is you determine what is included in that GPA, and you simply reveal to CAEP what was included when you report it. Okay. Let me see if there are any other questions, and then I'm going to unmute for anybody. Can it just be pedagogy? Sure, it could just be pedagogy if that is the basis by which you make your decisions about admission. I think you might get some pushback from CAEP if it's just pedagogy courses, if only because they're big on the deep content knowledge. And so you're going to want to show in component 1.1 and others that at admission you're accessing the content knowledge of the candidates that are hoping to come into teacher preparation programs. So you might get a little pushback on that if you simply use pedagogy courses and don't take any academic courses into consideration. So you might want to set up a couple of comparison points there. Like what was the GPA in pedagogy courses, what was the GPA on academic courses considered to be important for the content knowledge for that discipline. Okay, so if it's a math teacher, for example, you could compute, the math courses as content knowledge and do a GPA there and compare it to GPA in pedagogy courses. However, anyways, that's just something for you to think about. And I think in some of these cases, as long as you can substantiate and provide a strong rationale for the choices you've made, I think CAEP would find that defensible. And if they don't, they're certainly going to let you know at the time of the off-site review. When will YouTube be available? That's a good question. Usually, it's within a week. But I'm saying by April 15th, okay, because that gives them 2 weeks, and 2 weeks in advance of the next webinar, which is being held on April 25th. So that's what I can tell you. Okay, everybody. According to my records, we are now at almost 6:15. I am finished with my part of the webinar. I'm going to unmute in case anybody would like to hang out with me for a while and ask questions. Otherwise, I hope to see you for Standard 4 and Standards 5 coming up in April and May. And thank you. Okay, let me do one more thing here. I can get this into a different view. Whoops. I don't want to shut this off. Let me